I want to talk in some detail about the Citizens Commission for Human Rights, or the CCHR. The CCHR was created in 1969, founded by the Church of Scientology and by famous renegade psychiatrist Dr. Thomas Szasz. The purpose of its founding was basically to create a legitimate front in the Scientologists' war against psychiatry. Over the years, the CCHR has often downplayed or disavowed any connection to Scientology. It does that to increase its acceptability and to have its messages seen as rational and scientific, as opposed to religious and opposed to simply being a part of the Church of Scientology. However, I want to challenge that. From day one, most or many of the senior leadership of the CCHR have been Scientologists. So yes, the CCHR is open to anyone of any type of religious persuasion, but the leadership and the majority of the participants are and always have been Scientologists. The CCHR has continued from day one to be sponsored and financially supported by Scientology, including the International Association of Scientologists. And these connections, you know, the staffing connections, the people connections, the financial connections, become a lot more clear when we examine some of the internal CCHR and the internal Scientology sources, as opposed to what the CCHR says on the outside for the public. Here, for example, is a paper from 1978, Citizens Commission on Human Rights. This is a CCHR paper for internal distribution. It says, if you are a Scientologist, your future track may be endangered. It goes on to say that they're talking about suppressive groups, and we are well aware of exactly who on this planet has the technology to expose and eliminate them. And those suppressive persons know exactly what technology is the most deadly now available on this planet to harmeth Thetan. So listen to that. We're talking about Scientology jargon, we're talking about using the word suppressive, we're also talking about using the word Thetan, we're talking about technology. These are all Scientology words explicitly within this CCHR document. It's very interesting. There's also further material, and here's another example. This is the magazine of the International Association of Scientologists, Impact Magazine, the 24th annual anniversary, and issue 119. And this is much more modern, it's a few years old, and in this magazine, which is distributed to Scientologists internally, talks about their new plan for psychiatry, global vaporization. And this is what it says very casually. It says, this is psychiatry, global vaporization, and is funded by grants from the IAS, the International Association of Scientologists. It is how CCHR is ripping the veil off psych drug fraud, psych drug deaths, and obscene psychiatric profits, and is bringing an end to the psychiatric horror for millions. So again, there's this casual interchangeability, this, yes, it's an IAS-sponsored thing, the CCHR is doing it. This is a very well-integrated situation here. One of the things that the CCHR does is it capitalizes deliberately on its name, human rights. And the rhetoric that this organization puts out pertaining to human rights is really quite staggering. From the CCHR International website, the current president of the CCHR says, and I quote, "Our work aligns with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reads in part, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment." It says, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. And it goes on to say, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. Now what's interesting is, coming along and reading this, one would think this is a human rights organization. These people are very serious when it comes to international human rights. But in every one of those things I just mentioned, if you understand the beliefs that Scientology and CCHR have about psychiatry specifically, you'll see that these words, from their point of view, are absolutely anti-psychiatry and justify the attacking of psychiatry. So the United Nations talks about people not being subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And we can all imagine around the world what that might look like in certain countries and for certain groups of people. For the CCHR, their belief is that modern, safe, well-regulated, appropriate psychiatric practice in every big city, in every hospital, in every psychiatrist's office around North America is actually, quote, torture or cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment. So their definition of psychiatry and what psychiatry is actually, in their mind, filters in to this human rights setup that they have. So we read it and we think, wow, that's impressive, it's a human rights organization. But from their point of view, they are taking the language, they're taking the rhetoric of human rights, and they're twisting it to further substantiate, to further justify their completely off-base opinions and beliefs regarding psychiatry. So to recap a little bit, the CCHR is not about human rights. The CCHR has taken the language of human rights and it uses it to become more legitimate in the eyes of casual observers, and it uses it to justify its own efforts to destroy psychiatry. And it's actually the destruction of psychiatry, which we've talked about in Scientology and now in the CCHR, that is ultimately their goal. I want to read a little bit from a very interesting document that comes from the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. It's an international executive directive dated November 28, 1989. And this is something that sort of sets up a sense of what their approach and what the things that are important to the CCHR really are. And this is a document that talks about what they call psych losses, which is basically, they say, this new expanded psych losses stat opens the door to really cleaning up the field of mental healing, putting criminal psychs behind bars and getting their destructive practices outlawed. So it's basically not about human rights, it's about destroying psychiatry. And psych losses is a fascinating, fascinating document. It's basically kind of a participation program or a frequent flyer program or a points or loyalty, consumer loyalty program that gives CCHR members and Scientologists particular points or particular rewards for certain behaviors that damage or destroy psychiatry. So for example, in here on page 3, when it comes to publishing books, it says you get 10 points per page of material which exposes rotten spots in the field of mental healing per 100,000 printing. Example, there have been several books published in the last year which have had chapters containing data about psychs supplied by the CCHR. If one of these had 10 pages of anti-psych materials and the first printing was 50,000 copies, that would be 50 points. If the book was made successful and then went into a second printing of 100,000 copies, that would be an additional 100 points.